Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Responding to Something Interesting I Saw on Social Media. This one actually has three different levels. One is an initial post, the other a response to that post, and the other a question directed at said responder. So, this is the original. This comes from a site called For Reading Addicts that I follow on Facebook. And it's actually the last couple of lines of a post dealing with the importance of representation, which is always a good issue for me, and the tendency to employ book restrictions. People don't like it when you call it book banning because they claim, well, books aren't banned. You can buy them at the store. Sure, but book restrictions, that restricts the amount of people who have access to it, and it also restricts conversations that can be had around those books. So, I quote, books don't just entertain, they validate, they challenge, they connect. When you ban a book, you're not protecting people, you're deciding whose stories are allowed to exist. So naturally, I read that and I was totally on board with that sentiment. I even shared it on my own wall. I could go on all day, and I probably will over time post more than once, actually, post multiple times on the importance of representation because this issue just keeps coming up. It's not that, because there are people who will claim representation doesn't matter because all you have to do is learn to identify with and relate to the struggles and the stories of people who are not like you, of people who are of a different gender, race, etc. So, if you can't relate to all these classic stories about straight white guys, it's because there's something wrong with you. You're the problem. Well, the problem is not and has never been that people cannot relate to stories about straight white guys. The problem is that we shouldn't always have to. That shouldn't be the only kind of protagonist we ever get that is worth relating to. I've heard it said, this tends to come up in almost every conversation I've seen regarding representation. Quote, I don't care who the protagonist is, I just want a good story. Or I don't care about representation, I just want a good story. And on the surface, that sounds great. But if you look at it, if you squint, it seems to be suggesting that good representation, diverse representation, and a good story are somehow antithetical, that they're mutually exclusive, that if you can, you can either have good representation or diverse representation and a good story, but you can't really bring them together. And this suggests that, all those stories about straight white guys are inherently better than stories that feature any other kind of protagonists. And this has been something I've been butting my head against a wall that I have challenged again and again, and it's still there. No matter how much progress has been made, that wall remains. And there are people who want to strengthen that wall. So we shouldn't have to choose between good representation and a good story. But now I want to get to the other part, the idea of placing restrictions on books. What books can be taught in schools, what books can be discussed in schools, what issues can be examined in schools. because that's an issue related very strongly to the potential good effects of diverse representation. Learning that a protagonist doesn't necessarily have to be the traditional straight white guy. Because if all we see, because this is what I saw growing up, with the exception of To Kill a Mockingbird, until I got to college, almost every story was about a straight white guy or about people who were presented as straight white guys, like the Greeks and the Trojans in the Iliad, who were most likely not white Anglo-Saxon, but were nonetheless presented in that light. So those were the stories that were presented to me as classics, as worth studying. So if that's what you see again and again in school, then those are the stories you're going to identify with and have an idea of as the best. And many of them, I do not regret reading the Iliad. It was a wonderful story, or Oedipus the King, or the Shakespeare I read in high school. I liked most of the stories that I read in high school. It isn't that those stories are taught, but should they be the only stories taught? So, this was a response to For Reading Addict's original post. I do agree, well, it starts off with, I don't agree with book banning. I think book banning is wrong, but, quote, I do agree with age appropriate banning in the idea that an 11-year-old shouldn't be reading pornographic books. Fair enough. I think most people would agree with that, but here is where we run into a problem, because in response to this post, somebody asked what I think is a very legitimate question. What books are pornographic? Define that term. Define that term. What is porn? What constitutes porn? If we know specifically, if we get a clear working definition for what porn is, then we can protect tender eyes and ears and minds against it. I'd be all for that. But it probably doesn't come as any surprise to you who are listening to me that the person who wants to protect 11-year-olds from reading pornographic books did not respond to that very simple question. What is pornographic? What makes something pornographic? Give me details. Give me specifics. Let me know what we're talking about here. Crickets from that person. So, evidently, when somebody is asked to define exactly what porn is, they have a hard time. Or is it really a hard time? Because vague definitions are the biggest weapon in a book banner's or a book restrictor's arsenal. The vaguer the definition, the more power the book restrictors have. Because keep it vague, and that means almost anything can fall into that definition if the book restrictor wants it to. And that's why we have had rather significant, famous, talked about situations where such things have been called pornographic as Michelangelo's David. Famous example. And by the way, if you want to giggle, type into the search box on YouTube Saturday Night Live Michelangelo's David. Just type it in there, and what comes up should hand you a laugh. But not only Michelangelo's David, but there was also controversy around a graphic novel version of The Diary of Anne Frank, which was challenged because in one particular scene, You have Anne walking through a garden, and the garden is lined with statues, marble statues that are nude. No genitalia showing, just your standard issue nude Greco Roman statues. But for some people, that made this particular graphic novel pornographic. So keep the definition vague, and it becomes a catch all. It becomes a weapon for people who want to eliminate certain stories from the classroom. And the stories that people really want to eliminate in the name of protecting kids from porn are, of course, stories with LGBTQ plus protagonists, or even stories that acknowledge the existence of LGBTQ plus people. For a lot of people, unfortunately, that is all a book needs to have for it to be considered porn. Earlier in For Reading Addicts post, she pointed out that reading the right book at the right time can save someone's life. For a long time, LGBTQ plus teenagers have been at the highest risk for suicide. And this is the place where a lot in high school, middle school and high school, people talk about 11-year-olds, back in elementary school, but middle school and high school, this has been the age group where people want to keep books with LGBTQ protagonists or even supporting characters that are LGBTQ. They want to keep them out of the classroom, out of the hands of students. So, what happens to students who happen to be LGBTQ plus? They can absorb the idea, particularly if they hear some of the conversations that happen around these stories. They can absorb the idea that their very existence amounts to porn. Is this the message that we want to send young people? I hope not. Thank you.